Back in the 1970s, the best memories didn't need plane tickets or big plans, just Dad, the open road, and a place you went over and over again. They were where childhood happened, and seeing them again might just break your heart a little, in the best way. The local Army surplus store was never just a store. It was a time machine, a treasure hunt, and a rite of passage all rolled into one. Dad would pull up in the old station wagon, and before we even got out, he would say, "Now we are just browsing." Famous last words. Inside, it smelled like canvas and machine oil, and every aisle had something to stare at like it had just come back from a secret mission. Camo jackets that felt 10 sizes too big, ration kits with instructions you could not decipher, and canteens that looked like they had already done a tour. You would run your fingers along the display knives while Dad asked the cashier what kind of tent could survive a Michigan winter. He was not buying a thing. That was not the point. It was about holding the past in your hands and imagining what it would be like to live a little rougher. You were not just a kid in sneakers anymore. You were a hiker, a soldier, a survivor. And for those few hours, that surplus store was your training ground. Funny how we remember it better than any shopping mall. But if you want to talk about real window shopping, let me tell you about the appliance store Dad never meant to walk out of with anything. He never bought a thing, and we never needed a thing. But the appliance store on Route 17, that was a showroom of dreams. The moment you stepped inside, it was like the future had been laid out under fluorescent lights. Fridges the size of Cadillacs, dishwashers that promised miracles, and those clunky microwaves that looked like they could launch satellites. Dad would do the full lap, hands in pockets, nodding like he understood the specs. "Now this here's got dual defrost," he would say, which meant absolutely nothing to any of us. Meanwhile, you were just there for one thing, the donut samples. Right by the scratch and dent section, on a little fold-out table with a paper plate and toothpicks stabbed into sugar-dusted treasures. If you got lucky, there might even be coffee, lukewarm, but still free. Sometimes a salesman would corner Dad, and he would nod solemnly, asking questions like he was running a restaurant and not just trying to keep the toaster alive for another year. It was never about buying. It was about imagining. About standing in front of a top-of-the-line freezer and picturing your name on the deed to a better life. But when it came to good times and cheap thrills, nothing froze time quite like the local bowling alley. You know the place. Wood paneling on every wall, carpet so sticky it felt like your shoes might stay behind without you. The local bowling alley was not fancy. It was not even clean. But it was ours. That neon open sign buzzing in the window like it had not taken a break since 1963, that was the beacon. Dad would hand you a pair of shoes that smelled like defeat and victory all at once, then lace up his own with the confidence of a man who once bowled a turkey in '68. Scoreboards flashed with those pixelated animations, and the jukebox in the corner had a permanent skip in track 6. The cheese fries came in paper boats, scalding hot and gooey enough to glue your soul together. You would keep score with a tiny pencil, and Dad would act like the math was rocket science. For some reason, that made it better. There was always one ball he swore by, the dusty maroon one with a chipped thumb hole that he said gave him more spin. It never did, but he let you try it anyway. And after every frame, win or gutter, he high-fived like it was the championship. But if you really want to see Dad in his element, wait until you hear about the Dented Can grocery run. The Dented Can discount grocery store was the kind of place you never admitted shopping at, unless you were Dad. Then it was a badge of honor. You did not bring a list here. You brought instincts. Aisles of unlabeled tins, faded labels, and cardboard signs scribbled in permanent marker, 10 cans for $1. What cans? Who knew? Dad would hold one up and say, "Beef chunks and gravy." Sounds promising, like he was about to enter it in a cooking competition. Most of the time it was mystery meat roulette, but we were not there for the menu. We were there for the thrill. He treated the whole store like an auction. "Name brand beans. Get them while they last," he would whisper, like a man uncovering buried treasure. At checkout, he would proudly announce how much he saved. Never mind the fact that dinner might be spaghetti and something we would call tomato adjacent. You learned to laugh, to try everything once, and to realize a meal made on the cheap still meant you had one. But for a different kind of treasure, tucked away in someone's garage, let me tell you about the model train shop that made time stand still. It was not advertised. It was not even on a main road. Just a crooked wooden sign and a driveway that dipped behind an overgrown hedge. But if Dad tapped the wheel twice and said, "Here we are," you knew it was magic. The model train store in the back of someone's garage was no bigger than a single-car stall, but inside, it felt like a kingdom. Shelves were packed to the rafters with tiny train cars, tracks, tunnels, even tiny trees with even tinier squirrels. The air smelled like dust and old metal, the kind of smell that never leaves your coat. You would lean in to watch the train circle a miniature mountain range while Dad made small talk with the gray-haired man in suspenders, who clearly ran the whole operation on nothing but love and nostalgia. "This one's from 1952, the man would say, handing Dad a coal car like it was a rare coin. You did not know what made it special. You just knew Dad's eyes lit up in that way he saved for fishing trips and baseball games. It was not just a store. It was a secret clubhouse for grown men who still believed in toy engines and pretend towns. And if you think that was charming, wait until you smell what comes next. Free popcorn at the furniture store. There was no intention to buy anything, and everyone knew it. The furniture store with the free popcorn machine was Dad's idea of a Saturday outing. You would walk in and get hit with that smell, leather, fresh carpet, and hot butter. Dad would head straight for the recliners, and you? Straight to the red and silver popcorn machine near the back. It was always humming, full of those little white bags that were supposed to be single-serve, but somehow you found a way to go back 5 times without getting caught. Meanwhile, Dad was doing his test sit. That meant stretching, sighing, and rocking the recliner back and forth like he was making a real decision. "Too stiff," he would say. "This one's a back killer." The sales guy always came over and Dad would nod along, arms crossed, like he was closing in on the deal of the century. But you knew he was not buying a couch, he just liked the idea of picking one. And that popcorn? It was better than movie theater popcorn because it was earned. All this to say, shopping never felt like shopping with Dad. It felt like a game. But speaking of buttons, lights, and games, let me tell you about the kind of place where Dad's inner nerd really came to life: Radio Shack. You did not go to Radio Shack to shop. You went there to touch. The moment you walked through the door, it was like stepping onto a spaceship. Racks of wires, batteries, and gadgets you had never even heard of. And in the middle of it all, the demo table, a flashing, beeping paradise. Dad would say, "We're just browsing," but an hour later, he was still pressing buttons, turning knobs, and pretending he was building a satellite in the garage. You would find the mini keyboard and try to play "Mary Had a Little Lamb" while he talked tech with the teenage clerk behind the counter. Every once in a while, he would point at something and say, "I had one of these back in college," even if he definitely did not. He would pick up a transistor radio, weigh it in his hand like a jeweler inspecting a rare gem, and give a long, low whistle. Solid piece of work. He never bought anything over $20, but you always walked out feeling like you had been part of a NASA mission. If imagination had a store, it was that one. And right around the corner from that tech wonderland, a pet store where you begged and somehow always walked out with something in a plastic bag. The strip mall pet store did not smell like adventure. It smelled like wood shavings and fish food. But when Dad said, "Let's stop in for a minute," you knew it meant 20. The walls were lined with glass tanks full of turtles, frogs, and fish that looked too bright to be real. You would press your nose against the glass and point. "That one. I want that one." Dad would shake his head and smile. "We're not getting a turtle." 5 minutes later, you were holding a goldfish in a plastic bag, trying not to spill it on the seat of the car. He was not a pushover. He just knew the power of a memory. And that pet store, as humble as it was, felt like a mini zoo to you. There was always one sleepy lizard under a heat lamp and a parrot that squawked like a broken doorbell. Sometimes you would hear, "Hey there," from across the room and realize the bird was mocking you. Dad would strike up a conversation with the guy behind the counter like they were old war buddies, swapping advice on filters and food pellets. You would head home with a tank, a packet of food, and a new responsibility you were not quite ready for. And when you were ready for something outdoorsy, Dad knew just the place, with canoes and no life jackets in sight. The canoe rental shack by the creek was not a business so much as a suggestion. A crooked sign, 3 boats tied to a tree, and a man named Gary who might have been there since 1948. Dad would slap a 20 into Gary's hand and say, "We'll be back in a couple hours," like it was no big deal. No forms, no helmets, no waiver. Just a paddle, a life vest that definitely had not been certified since Eisenhower, and you, wobbling into a canoe while Dad shoved you off the bank with 1 foot. Once you got going, though, it was quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you realize just how loud life usually is. Birds overhead, water slapping against the side, and Dad telling the same story about how he once saw a snapping turtle the size of a garbage can. You never saw one, but you wanted to. You learned how to steer, sort of, and how to duck when you went under a low branch too late. You got soaked, you laughed, and when you finally dragged the canoe back onto dry land, Dad would clap you on the shoulder like you had just completed Navy SEAL training. But if that creek showed you the earth, the next place aimed a little higher, right up into the stars. Some nights, it was the backyard. Other times, it was the town planetarium where the air smelled like metal seats and carpet glue. But either way, Dad made sure you always looked up. He would point at a blinking light in the sky and say something like, "That one's Venus," even if it was just an airplane. You believed him, because he said it with the same certainty he used when fixing the lawnmower. Sometimes he would bring out a telescope that never quite focused right, but it did not matter. You could see the moon, or at least a very bright blur that had to be the moon, and that was enough. He told you about constellations, meteor showers, and a comet he swore he saw when he was 12. The planetarium nights were just as magical. You would lean back in those creaky seats while the ceiling lit up with galaxies and a deep voice narrated the birth of stars. Dad would whisper facts like he had a PhD in astronomy, even if he probably read them from the brochure 5 minutes before. You did not go to learn. You went to dream. And the only thing better than dreaming about space? Digging through the universe of stuff at the local flea market the very next weekend. The flea market at the county fairgrounds was not just an event. It was an ecosystem. Hot pavement under your feet, the smell of popcorn mixing with motor oil, and a wall of voices haggling like they were at a medieval bazaar. Dad had a game plan. He always did. First, a lap to scout. Then back around to make the real choices. You wandered behind him wide-eyed, marveling at tables full of license plates, rusted tools, vintage comic books, and a surprising amount of questionable homemade jerky. One guy sold nothing but bumper stickers with sayings that would get you sent to the principal's office. Another had rows of toy yo-yos. And even though Dad warned you, you begged for one anyway. It broke in 5 minutes, maybe 6, but you still carried it around like it was gold. There was always a booth with used records blaring classic rock through dusty speakers, and Dad would flip through the crates like he was searching for buried treasure. Every once in a while, he would hold one up and say, "Now this is music." You did not argue. Not when he looked that happy. And if you thought flea markets were a lawless land of loose change and sunburns, just wait until you hear about the Kart Track that somehow never got shut down. The Kart Track with 0 safety rules looked like it was built by someone who once saw a racetrack in a dream and then tried to recreate it with duct tape and a prayer. The sign out front read, "Family Fun." But you knew this was Dad's kind of fun. He paid cash to a man with a sunburn and a clipboard, and before you knew it, you were strapping into a plastic rocket with wheels. No seatbelt, no helmet, just a stern warning. Do not hit your sister. Dad, of course, was already in his own cart, revving the engine like it was the Daytona 500. The track was a cracked loop with grass growing through it and tires stacked too high as a boundary. The exhaust fumes were strong enough to water your eyes, and the cart screeched like a choir of angry lawnmowers. You skidded, bumped, and spun out more than once, but you never forgot the thrill, especially when Dad passed you on the last lap, one hand on the wheel, the other waving smugly. That victory lap? It lasted all week, and if you were lucky, he would let you stay just a little longer, because the community swap meet down at the church lot was about to open, and Dad never missed that one. The community swap meet in the church parking lot was a patchwork quilt of folding tables, lawn chairs, and a whole lot of neighborhood hustle. It was always held early, way too early, and Dad would pull up with a thermos of coffee and a plan. This was not a place for big spenders. This was a battlefield of bartering. He would go straight to the tables stacked with transistor radios, old tools, and that mysterious plastic bin full of tangled cords that might be useful someday. You were eyeing the table with the mismatched action figures and board games missing all the pieces. There was always one guy who sold nothing but velvet Elvis paintings. No one ever saw him set up or pack up. He was just there. The swap meet had its regulars. The Tupperware lady with 1,000 lids and no matching containers. The comic guy who only sold back issues from 1974. And the woman with jars of jelly that looked more suspicious than sweet. But Dad? He moved through it all like a seasoned pro, chatting with everyone like they were old buddies, walking away with something bizarre like a minifan or a set of ceramic pigs, and when he said, "Let's stop by the junkyard real quick," you knew things were about to get even stranger. The all-you-can-fit junkyard was not a store. It was a scavenger hunt with tetanus on the side. Dad would wear his work pants, which meant they had oil stains older than you were, and he would grab a wrench like he was Indiana Jones about to head into the temple. The guy at the front desk waved him through like an old friend. "Take whatever you can carry," he said, and Dad took that as a challenge. Rows and rows of sun-bleached cars with their guts spilled out, broken washing machines, and lawn mowers that had definitely seen war. Dad would pop a hood, grunt like he found treasure, and climb inside the thing like he was becoming one with it. Meanwhile, you were busy poking through the wreckage and came across something unforgettable, an actual raccoon skull. No idea how it got there. You just knew it was going in your backpack. At some point, Dad would emerge, sweaty and victorious, holding a car mirror or some hose that just needed a clean. It was less about the parts and more about the hunt. And when the sun started setting and he said, "We've got time for one more stop," you hoped it would be the fishing hole, the one no one else knew about. There were no signs, no trails, and definitely no cell reception. Not that it mattered. The hidden fishing hole Dad always took you to might as well have been a secret passed down through generations. You had to park on a dirt shoulder, hop a barbed wire fence, and walk through brush that snagged at your socks like it wanted you to turn back. But then, there it was. A quiet patch of water framed by trees and pure silence. No people, just frogs, the buzz of dragonflies, and the occasional splash of something just out of sight. Dad would hand you a rod, already rigged, and say, "Let's see if they're biting today," like it was a ritual. He always had a story about the one that got away, usually involving a fish the size of your leg and a broken line. You never saw it, but you believed him. And on the days you did catch something, even if it was just a bluegill the size of a cookie, he would hoot and holler like you had just pulled up Moby Dick. You would sit there side by side, quiet except for the occasional snack or Dad humming an old tune. But if you want to hear about the reward after a good fishing trip, let me take you to the drive-through dairy farm. Glass bottles, cold milk, and maybe even ice cream. The dairy farm drive-through felt like something out of a storybook. You did not get out of the car. You just rolled forward slowly on a gravel path that crunched under the tires like popcorn, while the smell of hay and cream filled the air. Wooden signs pointed the way. Milk, cream, eggs, and sometimes fresh butter today. Dad would pull up to the window, nod at the farmhand, and exchange a couple of glass bottles like they were precious cargo. You could hear them clinking together softly in the metal crate behind the seat, already cold with condensation. If you had been on your best behavior, meaning no backseat bickering and no complaints during the wait, he would ask the real question, "You want a cone?" It was always a yes. The scoop was big, the cone was soggy by the time you were halfway through, and somehow it still tasted like heaven. Sometimes Dad would get one too and say, "Best $2 I ever spent." And as the cows in the distance mooed lazily and the sun painted gold across the field, you realized simple things could feel grand. But if you think that was charming, Just wait until you step inside the used bookstore that sold both dusty novels and ham radios whispering from across the country. The used bookstore with the ham radios in the back was the kind of place where time folded in on itself. You walked in and the smell hit you first: paper, dust, and something that might have been pipe smoke from 50 years ago. Dad would head for the nonfiction section like it was a treasure map, and you would start flipping through comics that had long-forgotten characters in them. Every wall was covered in books, stacked too deep, sometimes sideways, sometimes just crammed in with no regard for order. But the real secret was in the back room. That was where the ham radios lived. Static buzzed from old speakers, and every now and then a voice would crackle through saying something like, "Calling from Connecticut. Do you copy?" Dad would nod slowly, say, "Nice rig," and start talking shop with the owner like they were part of some invisible club. You never understood a word of it, but it felt cool anyway, like your dad knew something no one else did. He would pick up a radio, fiddle with a dial, and say, "This one's got personality." The man behind the counter always nodded like that meant something. But if you thought that place had character, wait until you see Dad at the county auction barn, outbidding strangers for a box of who knows what. The county auction barn was chaotic, dusty, and loud, and Dad loved every minute of it. From the second you stepped inside, it was a sensory overload. Wooden pens clucked with chickens, bleated with goats, and somewhere a sheep was loudly objecting to something. The auctioneer stood on a platform, voice rising and falling like a song only locals understood. He had his bidding number tucked into his shirt pocket and a mental budget that always magically doubled if the right box came along. There were tables of mystery items, rusty tools, mismatched Tupperware, bundles of wire, and once a broken vending machine that Dad swore he could fix. $10? That's a steal, he would whisper, just before being outbid by the same guy who always bid too high. You did not win much. But when Dad did walk out with something, it was like he had climbed Everest. And even when he lost, he laughed all the way home. The auction was not about getting stuff, it was about the thrill. But when he wanted a guaranteed win, all he needed was a firehouse griddle, a bottle of syrup, and a pancake breakfast made by heroes. The Firehouse Pancake Breakfast was not just a fundraiser, it was a local holiday. Dad would wake you up early on a Sunday, say, "Put on your shoes," and before you could ask questions, you were in line behind a dozen people all craving the same thing, a plate piled high with pancakes. The folding chairs wobbled, the long tables had little dents and permanent syrup rings, and everything smelled like melted butter and maple sugar. Real maple syrup was a luxury, so they used the bottled kind, the kind that came out slow and stuck the lid shut like glue. Firefighters in aprons manned the griddles, flipping pancakes like they had trained for it. Dad would nod in approval, pile his plate, and crack a joke to someone in line about how this was the real breakfast of champions. Dad never won, but he always bought 5 tickets just in case. It was not about the pancakes, really. It was about community, about showing up. And when breakfast was over, he would say, "Let's make a stop on the way back." That stop? Usually a roadside museum with one very questionable claim to fame. The Oddball Roadside Museum was where logic went to take a nap. You saw the hand-painted sign from the highway, "Come see the world's largest pencil," or "America's first toaster, still works." Dad would swerve into the gravel lot like it was destiny. Admission was cheap, $3 cash only, and worth every penny. The inside was a fever dream. Display cases filled with bottle caps from all 50 states. A whole wall dedicated to vintage shampoo bottles. A 2-headed taxidermy calf that haunted your dreams for a week. "You brought the kid today, huh?" he would say, as if Dad came here weekly. You followed them through rooms of strange collections while Dad laughed and read every single placard out loud. It was like watching a kid in a candy store, only the candy was lawn darts, Pez dispensers, and World War II ration kits. "Now this," Dad would say, holding up a glass jar with something floating in it. "This is history." And even though you rolled your eyes, part of you agreed. But if you really want to feel history in motion, Just wait until you join him by the old train tracks, watching boxcars roll by, counting like your life depended on it. The local train tracks were not on any map of attractions, but they might as well have been your Saturday headquarters. Dad would pull up to that familiar patch of gravel beside the crossing, engine off, thermos in hand. Steam curled from the lid as he poured black coffee like he was settling in for a movie. You sat on the hood, knees pulled up, eyes scanning the horizon. Then, clack, clack, clack. The first rumbles came. A distant whistle echoed across the fields, and the train rolled in, all muscle and thunder. Dad would nod like he timed it himself, and the counting began. 1, 2, 3. Boxcar after boxcar, faded logos, rust streaks, some tagged with graffiti from cities you had never seen. Sometimes you brought a notebook, sometimes just your eyes, but you always left with the same question. Where were they all going? Dad would lean back against the car, sip his coffee, and tell you a story that may or may not have been true. It did not matter. What mattered was the rhythm, the waiting, the wonder. And if you were lucky, the next stop was just as legendary. A miniature golf course where no obstacle was regulation, and every putt told a story. The miniature golf course with homemade obstacles was never part of a chain. It was part of someone's backyard that got out of hand. The fence leaned, the AstroTurf peeled at the corners, and the scorecards were photocopies from sometime around 1967. But to Dad, this was sacred ground. "Watch out for the windmill," he would say, pointing to a lopsided contraption that spun more out of habit than engineering. Hole 6 had a dinosaur, once green, now a sad grayish blue with a missing eye, and hole 9 was uphill into what looked like a mailbox from a sci-fi movie. Dad kept score with one of those tiny pencils, sometimes generous, sometimes forgetting that penalty stroke. He cheered every shot like you had just qualified for a Masters tournament, and when he sunk a hole in one, he would raise his hands like he had won a trophy. The best part? Ice cream sandwiches at the end, slightly melted from the cooler behind the counter. You never asked for anything more. But if the ground game was that magical, just wait until you went airborne, watching planes take off from a sleepy little airport that felt like your own private runway. The small-town airport was barely an airport at all. A cracked runway, 2 hangars, and a chain-link fence with holes big enough to stick your face through. But Dad? He treated it like Kennedy Space Center. He would park the car at the edge of the lot, pop the hood up just enough for shade, and sit with a root beer balanced on the hood like he was waiting for clearance to launch. You joined him, legs swinging off the bumper, eyes on the horizon. Cessnas came and went, some buzzing overhead like dragonflies, others taxiing so slow it felt like they were afraid to leave the ground. "That one's a Skyhawk," Dad would say, as if naming a friend. "Twin engine, listen to the pitch." You nodded, pretending to hear the difference. Every now and then someone would land rough, and Dad would let out a low whistle. Bet he felt that one. The sun dipped lower. The planes grew fewer. But the quiet stuck with you, the feeling that for a few minutes the sky belonged to you. And when Dad said, "Let's stop by the photo shop on the way home," you knew the magic was about to get printed. The camera and film shop was a cathedral of forgotten technology. You walked in, and the air smelled like chemicals and time. Behind the counter, rows of yellow Kodak envelopes waited like tiny mysteries. Dad would head straight for the slide carousel projectors, lifting one like it was a sacred artifact. "Kodachrome," he would whisper. "They just don't make colors like that anymore." You did not know what he meant, but you believed it. You spun the projector just to hear the satisfying click, click, click of slides falling into place. There were shelves of lenses, tripods, flash bulbs in boxes older than you, and glass cases of second-hand cameras that looked more like museum pieces. Dad talked shop with the clerk, dropping words like aperture and ISO like he was reading from scripture. You picked up a Polaroid and tried to figure out how it worked. The clerk let you snap one. The photo came out blurry, overexposed, but it still felt like magic. Dad bought a roll of film, maybe 2, even though he already had 6 at home. "Just in case," he would say, "just in case the light hit right." And on the drive home, with the bag of film in his lap, he would say, "One quick stop." That stop? A smoky little pool hall where you got a taste of grown-up cool, even if just for one night. The Smoky pool hall was absolutely, positively not for kids, except for the one time Dad brought you and said, "Just this once." The room smelled like cigars, old felt, and secrets. Neon beer signs buzzed faintly, casting colored light across rows of tables where grown men hunched like philosophers over green cloth. Dad walked in like he owned the place. A couple of the regulars nodded his way, and one said, "Got the kid today, huh?" Dad just grinned. He set up at table 3, his lucky one, and handed you a cue that was a little too tall. "Always chalk it first," he said, demonstrating like he was passing down a family recipe. You took the shot. It was terrible. He applauded anyway. Dad sank a tricky bank shot and winked. "Still got it," he said. You wanted to believe he never lost it. No prizes, no points, just the sound of laughter echoing through smoke and sawdust. And when you stepped outside, your shirt smelled like the pool hall for the rest of the day. But the best part? That memory was yours forever. And next up, we are heading someplace even stranger, where camo jackets and canteens turned kids into explorers. Beefsteak Charlie's did not want you to just eat. They wanted you to feast. This was the kind of place that dared you to come hungry, then dared you again to leave room for dessert. Their tagline was, "You're gonna get spoiled," and honestly, they meant it. With a full salad bar, all-you-can-eat shrimp, and unlimited sangria, beer, and wine, it was less a dinner and more a challenge. The vibes? Equal parts wood-paneled steakhouse and slightly buzzed family reunion. People went for birthdays, promotions, divorces, any excuse to eat until your waistband begged for mercy. And the food? Surprisingly solid. The steak was not exactly filet mignon, but it hit the spot. The shrimp came fast and endless. And the bread? Warm, crusty, and forgettable. But who was there for bread? Beefsteak Charlie's rode the wave of 80s extravagance until the bottom line caught up with them. Too much generosity and not enough foot traffic sealed its fate. But in its heyday, it was a buffet fever dream come to life. So if you thought that was decadent, just wait. The next restaurant stripped the glitz and turned hot dogs and tacos into a Southern California classic, with a name that only made sense once you saw the menu. Right out of the humble neighborhoods of the Midwest, specifically Mankato, Minnesota, Happy Chef, which first debuted in 1963, became known for its classic American diner fare, which included a lot of recognizable breakfast dishes and burgers. It also took some notes out of McDonald's playbook, as each location had this really eye-catching statue of the restaurant's mascot, which was a smiling, happy chef. The statue would be holding a spoon and a menu board, and some of those statues even spoke to customers, making it really popular with children. At its peak, it was around 60 locations strong, and those were more or less primarily in Minnesota and the neighboring states, but what it aimed to do, it did well. It had a regional grip that competitors couldn't shake off, and that gave a lot of other restaurants down the road the idea of having strong fan bases with your local regional communities rather than trying to capture a nationwide audience. JCPenney in the 1970s was a wild mashup of style and service. You'd go in for curtains and leave with a perm, bell-bottoms, and a catalog thicker than a textbook. Their in-store salons were squeezed between racks and cashiers, so you could try on a blazer, get a trim, and still be home for lunch. The air smelled like polyester, Aquanet, and sample perfume. Stylists talked over humming dryers while shoppers flipped catalogs at long counter desks. That catalog wasn't just for shopping. It was a family ritual. Everyone circled socks and toasters with different colored pens. It was part phone book, part wish list. And if you needed help, someone handwrote the item code like sacred text. You didn't just browse, you strategized. Hair dryers, fashion, catalog orders. It was a salon, store, and mailroom all in one. And if that sounds wild, wait till you remember grocery shopping under dim lights on creaky wood floors. Owning a Trapper Keeper in the 1980s felt like owning a briefcase made just for kids, but with neon colors, Velcro, and personality. These were not just folders. These were statements. You did not just store your homework in a Trapper Keeper. You stored your identity. From bold geometric designs to wild illustrations of race cars, dolphins, or laser grids that looked like they belonged in a science fiction movie, the outside of your Trapper Keeper said something about you. And that satisfying rip of the Velcro? That was music. It had pockets for pencils, slots for notes, compartments you never used but felt cooler just knowing they were there. There was something so absurdly organized about them that it made you want to turn your life into a schedule. You would write the dates on your notebook dividers, color code your subjects, and then forget all of it by Wednesday. But hey, the effort was there. You felt important carrying one around. It made you feel like you were growing up, and even if you never opened it for anything other than doodling weird cartoons during math class, it still felt like a win. But when it came to keeping track of things, there was one object that really made you feel like a collector, and not just of stuff, but of memories. Long before Auntie Anne's took over shopping malls with that sweet almond glaze and cinnamon sugar swagger, there was Hot Sam Pretzels. This place was the original mall pretzel joint. The smell hit you like a buttery wall the moment you walked in. Their pretzels were big, doughy, salty, and piping hot. Perfect for tearing apart with your bare hands in between trips to the arcade and the food court. What made Hot Sam special was that it felt like it had always been there. You never planned to go to Hot Sam. You just walked past, caught a whiff, and suddenly you were standing in line. The classic salted pretzel was the favorite, but if you were bold, you went for the cheese-stuffed or even the jalapeno variety. They did not have 20 sauces or dipping cups. They had mustard. That was it. And it was glorious. Eventually, the brand got merged with Pretzel Time, and later, Auntie Anne's took over the pretzel game for good. But for kids of the 80s, Hot Sam was the flavor of an afternoon well spent. Speaking of things that left a taste and a legacy, our next stop is a little more complicated. A pancake house turned national chain, now remembered as much for controversy as it is for maple syrup. Sambos was made in 1957 all the way in Santa Barbara, California, and it had an extreme focus on capturing the market for families that wanted good, reliable breakfast options. It was a family restaurant chain known for its diner-style meals and its endearing pancakes, but how did they get their start? I'm not sure what the story was, but Sam Battistone Sr. and Newell Bonnet were the founders of the iconic restaurant chain, and the name was actually supposed to be a fusion of theirs. Personally, I think Sambo sounds a lot better than the other options that could come from those two names, but you let me know how you feel about that. Anyway, they were also known for one other obscure fact that I don't think a lot of you will catch. They were based off of the storybook known as The Story of Little Black Sambo, and a lot of their branding involved that, such as featuring tiger and jungle symbolism instead of outright referencing the book. Maybe because the book was slightly controversial, but the restaurant definitely wasn't, with 1,000 locations in just the 1970s alone. That is, until it did invite controversy. Eventually, Sambo started to become known for its racially insensitive branding, and despite their earnest attempts to rebrand into a more humane style of branding, it was unsuccessful, and it ended up closing down in the 1980s. The business practices it introduced are still followed by places like IHOP in America today, though, such as the idea of serving breakfast at all hours of the day. If we go on over to Miami Beach, Florida, in the 1956 time period, then there were these two brothers who really struck gold and no one saw it coming. Tom McCann in the 1970s was less of a shoe store and more of a fitting room on steroids. You didn't just try on shoes, you got seated, in a padded chair, by a man in a tie who measured your foot with a shiny metal contraption that looked like a tiny guillotine. It was formal, it was respectful, it was intense. The carpeting was deep enough to lose a penny in, and the walls were lined with glossy wooden displays featuring rows of loafers, Oxfords, and practical pumps in every shade of brown imaginable. The air smelled like leather, suede, and whatever polish they used to shine up the sample pairs. You'd sit politely while the salesman disappeared to the back, returning with a towering stack of orange boxes like some kind of shoe magician. You tried them on one at a time, walking awkwardly across the carpet while your mom and the salesman nodded approvingly. There were mirrors on the floor and tiny shoehorns on chains. It felt important, like choosing a suit of armor for your feet. But just beyond those plush floors and polished counters was a very different kind of store. A pharmacy where your toothpaste lived right next to a wall of mystery film envelopes. You had not lived until you beat the Oregon Trail without dying of dysentery. That was the holy grail of 1980s computer gaming. Those chunky gray computers in the school lab, that pixelated map, that relentless text box reminding you that little Timothy had broken a leg and your oxen just drowned crossing a river. Iconic. It was not just a game, it was survival. You learned real-life lessons in that pixel wilderness, like how much meat you could carry back from a hunt, not much, or why you should never try to ford a river without thinking it through. And somehow, we were totally into it. The green and black graphics, the clunky keyboard, the fact that it felt like schoolwork but kind of fun. You would all huddle around one screen, a group of 5 kids making group decisions like mini pioneers, and somehow it felt like the fate of your wagon family actually mattered. It was your first taste of choices in gaming, your first little moral dilemmas. Do you trade clothing for bullets? Do you rest for 2 days? Or do you push on and risk everyone freezing to death? Still, once the school bell rang, it was game over. And if you wanted to know what was playing in theaters that weekend, you did not Google it. You picked up the phone. Arthur Treachers' Fish and Chips felt like someone dropped a British pub right into the middle of American suburbia, minus the beer and with a lot more deep frying. Named after the dapper English actor known for playing butlers in old films, this spot promised the classic British fish and chips experience, but with a crispy, golden American twist. The fish, flaky, crunchy, and always steaming. The chips, thick-cut fries that could double as a side or a meal, depending on how hungry you were. And do not forget the little tubs of malt vinegar that gave the whole meal a tangy kick. It was greasy comfort food at its finest, wrapped in paper and handed over with a wink. In its heyday, Arthur Treachers had hundreds of locations scattered across the country. It was the place for people who wanted something fried but just a little different than burgers or chicken. Over time, competition and changing tastes wore it down. Most locations shuttered, leaving only a handful hanging on. But for anyone who grew up with one nearby, the smell of fried cod and vinegar still triggers a flood of memories. And speaking of memories, the next place on our list serves them up by the tray, with old-school charm, a flat-top grill, and a name that still rings out across the Midwest. NFL Hall of Fame inductee. Gino Marchetti and some of his partners came together in 1957 and came up with Ginos Hamburgers, first opening for business in the humble locale of Baltimore, Maryland. However, not so humble, it quickly became a fast food giant in the region. It was even known as Gino Giant, and part of that was because of that extremely towering, intimidating double-decker burger that would make even most grown men think twice about whether or not they could finish it. Gino's Hamburgers market was grown men, though, because it also had team-oriented marketing that was meant to appeal to NFL fans. It even partnered with the NFL and created a lot of leeway and goodwill with local sports communities and fans, and it even featured KFC chicken thanks to a licensing partnership with them. They had an approach to the fast food game that no one else had at the time, which was to build a solid community fan base and take full advantage of it. That dedication to regional success is still something that's echoed by a lot of fast food joints across America, and Gino's legacy lives on in all the places it's influenced. Radio Shack in the 1970s was the ultimate hideout for gadget lovers. You'd walk in and be hit with that plastic meat circuit board smell. The floors creaked. The walls, covered in wood paneling and stacked with speaker kits, batteries, and CB radios. It felt like your grandpa's basement exploded into a store. Every shelf had wires, switches, drawers full of diodes, and mystery tech you didn't dare pronounce. Kids checked out walkie-talkies. Dads vanished into the shortwave radio section for just a minute that lasted forever. The staff, half clerk, half-mad scientist, eager to explain why you needed a breadboard and how not to burn your fingers. There were demo tables tangled with cords and blinking lights. The catalog? Nerd heaven. Not flashy but dense, every aisle dared you to build something. Even if you had no clue what a resistor was, you probably still bought one. And before you left, there was always that blinking red LED by the counter, daring you to bring it home. But for all of Radio Shack's buzzing chaos, JCPenney had its own multitasking flair. Before Fandango or streaming apps told us what was playing, there was the operator. And calling the theater was an event in itself. You would dial a number, usually a long one, and wait as a robotic voice or sometimes an actual person listed off every movie in showtime like it was the State of the Union. Showtimes for the weekend of July 24th, Gremlins at 7:30, The Goonies at 9:15, Ghostbusters at 10:45. You could not skip ahead. You had to listen. Carefully, and maybe even write it down if you were planning a big night. If someone in the house picked up the phone while you were listening, forget it. You had to start over. And if you called during a busy hour, good luck hearing anything over the static and background noise. But it was still exciting. The build-up, the anticipation. You felt like you were about to join something important, something bigger than yourself. Because back then, watching a movie meant going somewhere. It meant tickets, seats, sticky floors, and that one kid who always threw popcorn. It meant magic. But if you wanted movie magic at home, you did not need a theater. You just needed to clear your schedule, grab the good blanket, and stake your claim on the couch. Rack's roast beef tried to be more than fast food. It wanted to be thoughtful, even elegant, an oasis for the roast beef connoisseur. And if that sounds like a joke now, back then, it was serious business. The logo had class. The menu had ambition. You could get a baked potato with real butter or pile your plate with pasta and pudding from the salad bar that stretched like a buffet dream. The roast beef sandwiches were stacked, the booths were plush, and in some locations, you could eat inside a glass atrium surrounded by artificial waterfalls and faux palm trees. Some even had a champagne room, which sounds wild until you remember it was the 1980s. But ambition sometimes runs into confusion, and Rack's never quite figured out if it wanted to be Arby's rich cousin or a full-blown sit-down experience. It tried to do too much, and in the end, it crumbled under the weight of its own salad bar. But speaking of places that loved doing too much, our next stop had popcorn on the floor, cartoons on the walls, and enough energy to fuel a second-grade birthday party. Speak and Spell, a name so simple, you almost forget just how advanced it felt. This little orange learning machine had a robotic voice that felt both comforting and unsettling at the same time. The keys were rubbery. The screen was a small LED display, and the second it powered on, you felt like a kid genius. This was not just a toy, it was a computer. At least to us it was. And for a lot of people, it was the first time they ever heard a machine talk to them like a teacher would. It would ask you to spell elephant or photograph in that slow, mechanical voice. If you got it wrong, it would buzz like you had just activated some kind of self-destruct sequence. And if you nailed it, that same robotic voice gave you praise like it meant something, like it knew you. Speak and Spell was part game, part lesson, and 100% magic. You did not need Wi-Fi. You did not need batteries half the time. All you needed was the imagination to believe that this talking toy was the smartest machine in the house. And sometimes, it probably was. Of course, intelligence was one thing, but style? That was another story. If you were the kid with this next item, everyone knew you had your life together. Red Barn was this fast food chain that ended up being known for its barn-shaped buildings, and in Ohio and Michigan, which had a massive concentration of chicken lovers given how well KFC is there, that was probably a great idea. Their menu also included a lot of what KFC's menu did, except they also had fish sandwiches. Red Barn was a local option that pioneered a lot of things in the fast food industry. It was one of the first fast food restaurants to even have a salad bar, and that was really rare for places like that back then. We might be used to them now, but the trend had to have started somewhere, and places like Red Barn definitely helped the idea get going. It also featured double-decker burgers and its iconic Barnbuster sandwich, which was so beloved by local communities in Ohio and Michigan and even other states that it gave titans like McDonald's and Burger King a run for their money. It had everything going for it: unique branding, an affordable menu with recognizable items but just enough new things to set it apart, and amazing quality, but it eventually ran into a lot of franchising issues and couldn't last. Though it did inspire a wave of more focus on architecture, just like White Tower did, because competitors took note how the barn-shaped buildings really helped pull in customers. Pup and Taco was one of those places that never made it all the way across the country. But for Californians, it was a staple. You knew what to expect: a wide menu, dirt-cheap prices, and a name that sounded like it was made up by a kid. Hot dogs, tacos, burgers, fries, slushies, they threw it all at the wall and somehow it worked. You could walk up, grab a chili dog and a taco, and be out in 5 minutes for under $3. The locations were easy to spot too. Those retro signs with the big red and yellow block letters were a beacon to beach bums and budget-conscious teens alike. There was nothing gourmet about it, but that was never the point. It was fast, it was greasy, and it was loved. So much so, in fact, that Taco Bell bought most of the locations in the 1980s, essentially absorbing Pup and Taco into its own empire. The quirky name might be gone, but the spirit lives on every time someone adds a side of nachos to their burrito order. And while Pup and Taco ruled the roadside, our next stop was the king of the mall food court. Soft, warm, twisted, and salted. The pretzel that walked so others could run. A name that was founded during the glory days of Lums and ended up giving it some serious competition was Steak and Ale, which actually went on the other end of the spectrum. Norman Binker, the founder, built the first Steak and Ale in Dallas, Texas. The way this contrasted from places like Lums was that while they focused on experimental food and new ideas that Americans wouldn't get at other places, Steak and Ale doubled down on the concept of how much Americans love a good steak. The problem was that around this time period, a lot of families were still recovering from the back-to-back effects of the historically disastrous cluster of events known as the Great Depression and the two World Wars, so there was a need for restaurants to be affordable if they wanted to keep dragging in customers. Steak and Ale was the pioneer of this kind of steakhouse, and it featured traditional American themes and an atmosphere that screamed Texas, almost as if the walls themselves were saying howdy to you. Prime rib, steaks, pork roasts, all for prices that the competition couldn't keep up with. And then, to top it all off, an all-you-can-eat salad bar that was so popular with both people who were trying to keep in shape and kids who loved experimenting with different wacky salad combinations. Steakhouses were known for being pricey, fancy places you'd take the family out to, so Steak and Ale really did customers a favor by introducing the idea of an affordable steakhouse. Mervyn's on a Friday night in the 1970s was less of a department store and more of a full-blown neighborhood event. You weren't just shopping, you were competing. The floors were linoleum, the racks were crammed, and the air was filled with the sound of intercom announcements about markdowns in men's casuals or juniors' denim. The sales were real, the rush was serious, and the line at the dressing rooms? A full contact sport. Families came in after dinner, still in school clothes and windbreakers, ready to hunt down that one clearance jacket or polyester blouse that someone spotted last week but didn't grab in time. The fluorescent lights buzzed, the hangers clacked. The prices were printed on fat paper tags with the clearance price circled in red ink. And if you found something actually in your size, you felt like you'd won the lottery. You went in for socks and left with 4 tops, a belt, and a story to tell. But when the clothes were bought and your cart was full, there was one place your heart and allowance was always saving room for, and the aisles were filled with joy, chaos, and cardboard boxes stacked to the sky. Made-for-television movies in the 1980s were not just filler. They were events. Whole nights were planned around them. When that promo would come on, this Sunday, only on ABC, you would perk up, lean in, and make mental notes to not miss it. This was before DVR, before pause buttons. You missed it? You missed it. These movies had titles like The Day After, V, The Final Battle, or The Ewok Adventure. Some were tearjerkers, some were thrillers, some were straight-up terrifying, and they had you glued to the screen, wondering how they managed to squeeze so much drama into 2 hours. Plus, commercials. Families would make popcorn, dim the lights, and treat it like it was an actual premiere. You watched it live together, and you talked about it the next day at school, because chances were everyone saw it too. They hit different. The music, the narration, even that grainy picture, it all added to the mood. You were not just watching, you were part of something. And right in the middle of those movies came the strange intermissions, ones that could go from innocent to haunting in 5 seconds flat. Ginos Hamburgers was one of those places that felt like it had everything: a solid burger, crispy fried chicken, a shake thick enough to challenge your straw. But the best part? It was co-founded by an actual National Football League Hall of Famer, Gino Marchetti of the Baltimore Colts. That kind of crossover was rare back then, and people loved it. The logo even had a little football player flipping a spatula like he had just sacked your hunger. Ginos was particularly big on the East Coast. You would see the glowing red signs as you drove past shopping centers and think, yeah, we are stopping there. It had this casual charm, nothing too flashy but dependable in a way that stuck with you. They even teamed up with Kentucky Fried Chicken for a while. You could get your burger and your bucket in one place. That is efficiency, 1980s style. Eventually, though, bigger names moved in, and Ginos fizzled out, with only a couple of locations hanging on in Pennsylvania and Maryland today. But ask anyone who grew up nearby and they will tell you, it was the real deal. And if Ginos was about hearty plates and gridiron glory, then our next stop was about indulgence. Lots of it. Shrimp by the pound, steak on demand, and wine that flowed freely. Bob's Big Boy ended up being founded in 1936 by Bob Wien in Glendale, California, and it actually preceded Ginos and made a big name for itself at Ginos' own game, which was having one unforgettable, phenomenal double-decker burger. This thing would turn even the staunchest of anti-beef believers into burger fans. I wasn't around back then, but my parents were, and they've seen that happen in real time. It also became known for something else my parents would never stop telling me about as they rant about how mascot culture is dead. That something was the Big Boy mascot statue, which is what people started to associate the restaurant with. It really gave it a sense of identity and a personal brand that set it apart from just another fast food place. Having an air of uniqueness like that can really help draw in customers, and if you're aiming to be a successful diner, you can never have enough of that. Bob's Big Boy ended up influencing a lot of diner culture, as its focus on a wide range of items like breakfast options such as sandwiches and comfort food go-tos like hash browns and burgers would make it known for being a family-oriented spot you could go to for a good, affordable meal. This is the same vibe and model that places like Denny's try to capture now. Ben Franklin stores in the 1970s were creative chaos in fluorescent light and linoleum. Half craft shop, half toy store, part Candyland, you could find yarn, glue, and jawbreakers all in the same 5-foot stretch. You'd walk in and instantly smell wax paper, plastic, and Elmer's glue. Aisles were narrow and packed with glitter tubes, googly eyes, and popsicle sticks bundled like fancy lumber. Kids zoomed to the back for erasers. Adults browsed embroidery hoops and paint kits. Grandpa was up front debating towels. The checkout was a sugar trap. Jawbreakers, wax lips, candy dots, and gum cigars that dyed your mouth for days. You didn't just shop there, you scavenged. You came in for one thing and left with 5. It was messy, a little dusty, and full of heart. And when it came to grocery stores with a bold love for color, none leaned harder into the 70s palette than Safeway. Sambo's restaurant was once everywhere. At its peak, over 1,000 locations dotted the American map, and for a time, it was the breakfast joint. You walked in, saw the tiger stripe motif, and knew pancakes were on the way. The food was solid: fluffy pancakes, greasy bacon, big mugs of diner coffee. The kind of breakfast that left you needing a nap by 10 in the morning. But Sambo's legacy is tangled. Its name and branding, drawn from a children's book with racist origins, sparked increasing backlash as public awareness and cultural conversations shifted. People started asking hard questions about what a restaurant should represent. The food stayed consistent, but the reputation cracked. One by one, locations closed or rebranded. And while the last original Sambos held on until 2020, even it finally changed names. Still, to many who grew up in its booths, it was not about the name. It was about pancake mornings with family and kids' meals with tiger-striped coloring books. But from syrupy stacks to something a little more British, the next forgotten favorite took a trip across the Atlantic and served up deep-fried nostalgia with a dash of malt vinegar. If one of these sparked a memory, drop it in the comments, like the video, subscribe, and tell us what forgotten place your dad always took you.